There is a group of people on social media that will tell you this is the greatest thing that's ever happened to X-Men, but clearly Marvel themselves do not agree. They're like, nah, actually, this isn't a great thing that's happened. It's actually a bad thing because we would like the X-Men to be somewhat relevant by the time the movies come out. We're going to have to take drastic changes. And I used to talk about X-Men a ton here on the channel. Specifically, I used to talk a lot about Adventures in Poor Taste, X-Men Monday, which I guess was a podcast originally, but then became like a newsletter article that came out every Monday once the Krakoan Era kicked off. And I guess we're at issue number 200 or episode 200 or whatever. So they sat down the entire X-Men office and talked to them. And I haven't really been covering this stuff lately because it's so boring. There are only so many times you can hear a really badly underqualified comic book writer, or perhaps somebody that's never even written a comic book in their entire lives say, yes, I was approached by Sarah Brunstad and she offered me the opportunity of a lifetime to write some characters that I know nothing about and I don't really care about. How much failure can one person be responsible for at Marvel Comics? I dare you to outdo Sarah Brunstad. I just don't think it's possible. And every time Charlie Gene Andrews or Steve Fox or Steve Orlando or any of these failures, Danny Lore, announced that they were coming onto the X-Men line, Sarah Brunstad's name always came up as the person that offered them the opportunity. And those people are all leaving, and they're now lauding their success on X-Men, despite the fact that Dan Buckley had to come down and basically remove all of them. Apparently, this was actually a good thing, and I had chuckles of derision. I laughed, but then it was like, I can't believe these people are celebrating the massive amount of failure that they actually brought into the X-Men line. Somehow they destroyed the most exciting thing to happen in X-Men in like 15 years, and they did it pretty fast. So I thought I would cover it today and talk about some of this amazing failure and some of these really stupid quotes. First, when talking about a specific character that blew them away in the Krakoan Era, this is what Steve Orlando had to say. The character work Vita Ayala and Charlie Jane Andrews did with New Mutants was wonderful from top to bottom. The cast was always huge, but each personality was distinct and compelling, and I don't think anyone's ever gotten me so into Sabretooth as Victor Laval. I could go on. You think what Vita Ayala and Charlie Jane Andrews did on New Mutants was wonderful from top to bottom. Vita Ayala's New Mutants run, the time she took it over, I guess it was originally Ed Brisson and Jonathan Hickman. They were doing two different story arcs. It never really worked. Vita Ayala took over. There were no distinct and compelling characters. Everyone had the exact same voice, and it was the typical Vita Ayala story. It's the same story Vita Ayala has been attempting to tell in comic books essentially the entire time she's been there. Never actually went anywhere, never actually had any sales, and never actually gave a character a distinctive voice. That's one of the big failings of Vita Ayala as a writer. One of the reasons they could never get out of their own way is nobody had a voice, and the fact that they told the exact same story over and over and over again, like some other big-time failures of comic books lately, is one of the reasons it's not distinct. It's not compelling. In fact, it was bad. And somehow, like mind-blowingly, somehow, it got worse under Charlie Jane Andrews, who I guess was supposed to be brought in as a big deal. Sarah Brunstad really broke out the Rolodex and brought in like an A-lister from outside of comic books. And you could tell Charlie Jane Andrews had never read a comic book, certainly had never read an X-Men comic book, certainly had never read a New Mutants comic book, didn't know who any of the characters were. It was basically just Escapade, Charlie Jane Andrews' self-insert character, and her lesbian friends. And none of them had a distinct, compelling personality or anything. They were all the exact same character, just palling around doing crime and stuff like that. That Charlie Jane Andrews New Mutants Lethal Legion story is one of the worst things I've ever read in my life. And that really says something. We're talking, it's competing with Tim Drake Robin. It's competing with Hawk Girl. It's competing with some of the most atrocious comic books that have been produced by DC and Marvel over the last 2 to 5 years. That's how bad it is. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the reason the Krakoan Era failed. Nobody could actually tell these people that's a bad idea. That doesn't work. That's not who that character is. Maybe you should actually write a good story. They just sat there in their X-Slack telling each other they were doing a good job while everyone failed left and right. Speaking of that, this is what Leah Williams had to say responding to that question. Tini Howard did incredible work with Betsy Braddock in Excalibur and Betsy Braddock Captain Britain, and solidified so many important new heights for her. Lastly, I have to shout out Zeb Wells for making me feel big feelings. about characters I'd never cared about before in Hellions. Certainly, you will not hear me disagree with that assessment regarding Zeb Wells' Hellions run. But obviously, the big red flag there from Leah Williams, Tini Howard did incredible work for Betsy Braddock. Betsy Braddock is an unsalvageable character at this point. Not only was the story stupid, not only was the concept of making Betsy Braddock no longer be Psylocke, now she's going to be Captain Britain, which makes Brian Braddock have no purpose whatsoever in the Marvel Comics universe, but it failed over and over. They actually did it 3 separate times, and it actually just got canceled faster and faster and faster every time they launched a new Tini Howard Betsy Braddock book. This was not her character. She hasn't solidified Betsy Braddock as Captain Britain. It's so stupid to celebrate things like this. I understand Leah Williams and Tini Howard are likely friends, but we don't have to go out there and laud the success of enormous failures. We don't have to act like the Excalibur run and Betsy Braddock, Captain Britain, and all this other stuff, Knights of X, were actually good stories. In fact, they were roundly rejected essentially by everybody. Why don't we point out stuff like Hellions? Why don't we point out stuff like Way of X? Why don't we point out things like the Children of the Vault storyline from Jonathan Hickman, Fantastic Four versus X-Men, the actual things that would have been the high water marks of creativity during the Krakoan era? Because yes, there are some things that work here and there. Hell, even Ben Percy at the beginning of his Wolverine run was pretty good. In fact, he did the best thing and really the only thing that was redeeming about Ten of Swords. That was on Ben Percy, the beginning of his X-Force run. Actually somewhat compelling until it became like the Plant Monsters story. And then let's not even mention Jonathan Hickman and Horticulture. My goodness, that was like the big moment where you screech the brakes. You're like, whoa, where the fuck is he taking this? This is really stupid. It's hard for me to believe that this is a Jonathan Hickman story or a concept. And things kind of went off the rails from that point. But acting like Tini Howard did incredible work is a lie. Leah Williams is supposed to be a professional writer. She knows that Tini Howard didn't write a good Betsy Braddock story. She knows that Betsy Braddock cannot be Captain Britain in 2 or 3 years because it never took. No one ever bought into it. And basically, she ended up breaking like 3 characters in the process. The actual Psylocke, Betsy Braddock, and Brian Braddock all in the same time. Like, that's actually something you can learn from on what not to do to destroy your comic book writing career. Later, they were asked about this year's Hellfire Gala. This is what Jerry Duggan said. "We've not made any creative decisions by fan reaction. And if we did, I don't think we'd still be working on X-Men comics 6 years after we commenced. The Hellfire Galas are bottled lightning. They're what happens when a couple dozen artists, editors, writers, and executives are all moving together towards the same goal, and the result crushes. They nourish different parts of the business, and I stood in one this past summer. The best X-Men comics are when their backs are against the wall, and that's why this year's Hellfire Gala will be an immortal comic book." That, sir, is absolutely false. There are so many things that you have to unpack there for Jerry Duggan. And I understand he took an idea from Chris Claremont, expanded upon it, and somehow it became a signature yearly event that actually kind of ruined his X-Men run. But the idea that it was lightning in the bottle and it was the rising tide that lifted all ships for the X-Men runs is patently false. There were no bumps as far as sales in any of the books associated with Hellfire Gala outside of X-Men, as far as I could even tell. Hellfire Gala wasn't that lightning in a bottle. It wasn't that thing that brought all the X-Men titles together and made them relevant all at the same time. It was a reason to sell variant covers. Hellfire Gala really never created an enormous storyline. It never created a big moment or a buzz that told people this is the time to get back into X-Men. You came back for House of X Powers of 10. We kind of messed that one up. But this year's Hellfire Gala is House of X Powers of 10 level storytelling, and this is when you need to come back. It didn't really happen like that. Yes, they were able to sell some covers with X-Men looking like idiots in prom dresses and cross-dressing and stuff like that on the covers. Not exactly game-breaking stuff in 2023. That's basically what's been saving Marvel's skin for quite some time now. And Duggan also said, "We don't make creative decisions based on fan reactions, or we wouldn't be here 6 years later." Well, you're not going to be there 6 years later because it's only been going on for 4 years. And to my knowledge, you are going to be off well before the 6-year mark. But I do think not making decisions or reacting or or course correcting based on fan reaction is one of the deciding reasons that Jerry Duggan won't be writing X-Men comic books 6 years later after starting on Marauders #1, because they never realized their failings. They never realized why their stories weren't exactly connecting with X-Men fans. Yeah, they were connecting with people on Twitter. They were connecting with people that liked to pirate comic books. They were connecting with people that weren't invested in the X-Men, but were invested in changing Marvel Comics as a whole and what the X-Men represent and what they stand for. Yes, those people were attracted to the Krakoan era and all these really bad writers because they don't care about the quality of the comic books. They don't care about the stories. They don't care about X-Men. They don't care about the universe. But it actually churned X-Men fans away. And X-Men is not a normal comic book. That is a tentpole comic book. That is one of the things that keeps people coming into their comic book shop every single Wednesday and hopefully buying more comic books and sampling things outside of X-Men themselves. That's why you need X-Men. That's why you need ASM. That's why you need Batman. That's why you need Superman. And acting like the fan reaction wasn't there, like the reaction of X-Men fans should have no dictation on the direction of what they were doing, is why they failed. It's why Dan Buckley had to go into Tom Brevoort's office and say, I need you to save X-Men from Jordan White and his legion of doofuses. They've actually fucked things up so bad, I have to go around CB Cebulski and talk directly to you because hopefully you can actually save it. And Hellfire Gala 2023, or what the fuck they call it at this point, will not go down as an immortal comic book. It's an afterthought. It's already an afterthought, and it only happened like 2 months ago. Tell me what actually happened in that comic book. You can't, because you don't remember either. We're not talking about Days of Future Past here. You know what I'm saying? We're not talking about the death of Gwen Stacy. We're not talking about a comic book that stands the test of time that people will still be reading and talking about in like 20 and 30 years. That's not what this is. That's not what the Krakoan era is. The Krakoan era of X-Men is an enormous warning, a warning to everybody else out there. Do not fuck up your franchise, because even if you think it's impervious to bad stories, this is what can happen. You can destroy sales almost across the board, and you will have to rebuild it from the bottom up if you break it this badly. Finally, talking about fall and rise of the House of X, if that was always the plan. This is what Leah Williams said. It was always the plan. I remember my very first Creative Summit meeting, sitting in a conference room with everyone as we listened to Jonathan Hickman overview his long-range plan that would be years in the making. It was always constructed to this end. I was awed at the scale and scope of it, and that such massive storytelling could be planned that far in advance and carried out. Not in terms of specifics within the books, mind you, but the inevitable fall of X. This is what Jordan White said. Yeah, for sure. There are parts of this that have been baked in since the very beginning, and then the collaborative nature of it all has meant it's kept evolving and had new things added in at every step. So there are elements that are very different from when it was first discussed, but there are some parts that have made it through this whole time intact. So do not let anybody tell you this was the ending that Jonathan Hickman had envisioned when he launched House of X Powers of 10. This is not the ending that we're supposed to be happening. In fact, Leah Williams was in awe that you could write a story with a beginning, middle, and end, know that it was going to last for 3 years, know exactly what stories you were going to tell, and actually have an end game in mind. She couldn't fathom that. I wonder why Leah Williams is not considered a good comic book writer. Perhaps she doesn't actually know how to tell stories. She doesn't know how to tell long-form stories. Jonathan Hickman had a plan, and it's going to go down as one of the biggest what-ifs in comic book history. What if Jordan White and the Legion of Doofuses didn't come in and fuck everything up? What if Jonathan Hickman was actually allowed to tell the story he came in intending to tell? Because we are going to get an ending to this. And yes, they are trying to harken back to House of X Powers of 10 with the House and Rise of the Powers and Falls of X, or whatever the stupid names are that make no fucking sense whatsoever. They're literally only there to remind you that they're connected to something, but they are not what it was intended to be. This is a completely bastardized version of the story that was supposed to be told. Jonathan Hickman had to leave the office early because he couldn't stand their incompetence. Jordan White was allowed to stay there because he embraced incompetence. He embraced failure. And that's why this thing is going down the way it is. It never, ever had to be like this. It could have ended after 3 years as one of the greatest runs in comic book history, one of the greatest runs in X-Men history. And now it's going to go down as a footnote and a warning to everybody out there. Do not let incompetent morons like Jordan White on your team. Do not let incompetent morons like Steve Orlando infiltrate your creative decisions. Do not let incompetent morons like Tini Howard and Leah Williams onto your team, because they absolutely will sink everything you ever set out to do. They will fuck up your story, and eventually you will leave before they do, and your story will never actually get told. The biggest what if in modern comic books history: what if Jonathan Hickman got to tell the story he fucking wanted to tell? What if one of the best writers in modern comics was actually allowed to do what he set out to do and wasn't interfered with by a bunch of fucking rejects under the leadership of Jordan White? I've talked about this, and there are things happening in the X-Men office. There's wide-scale change coming under Tom Brevoort. We are not sure exactly all the details, but we do know Jordan White and the Legion of Doofuses are out. Orgy Island is closed for business, and we're moving on to something hopefully better in the not-too-distant future. There's also a link in the video description.